The rancher shared his fire with the enemy. At sunrise, the unthinkable happened. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. They said the rancher had lost his mind the night he dragged the stranger into his cabin. They said a man did not share warmth with the enemy and lived to see the sun rise. Out here, where the land stretched wider than mercy and the wind carried old grudges across the plains, kindness was a language that often got a man killed. The rancher knew that. He had learned it the hard way, season after season, watching neighbors harden and friendships turn to dust. His name was Elias Moore, a man with more years behind him than ahead, living alone on a spread that barely held together with weathered boards and stubborn will. The cabin sat nearly 15 miles from the nearest town, tucked against a line of cottonwoods that whispered whenever the night grew restless. That evening the cold came early, the kind that slipped through wool and bone alike, turning breath into pale ghosts. Elias had just stoked the fire when he heard the sound outside. Not a knock, not a voice, but the heavy collapse of a body meeting frozen ground. He took his rifle from the wall and stepped into the dark, boots crunching softly. There by the fence lay a man he recognized by silhouette alone. A man from the other side of the river. A man whose people and his own had been circling each other for years like wolves deciding who would bleed first. The stranger was wounded, blood dark against the frost, his breathing shallow and uneven. Elias stood there longer than he would later admit, feeling the weight of every warning he had ever been given. He could leave the man where he lay. No one would blame him. In fact, many would call it justice. But the fire behind him crackled, steady and patient, reminding him of nights long past when he himself had been the one near death, saved by hands that did not ask who he was or where he came from. With a grunt that sounded more like surrender than resolve, Elias lowered his rifle. He dragged the wounded man inside, laid him near the hearth, and fed the flames until the cabin glowed with orange light. He cleaned the wound with water he could barely spare and wrapped it with cloth torn from his own spare shirt. The stranger watched him with eyes sharp even through pain, expecting betrayal at every turn. No words passed between them. None were needed. Outside, the wind rose and fell. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried, answered by another. Elias kept the fire alive through the night, sitting in his chair with the rifle across his knees, not in threat, but in habit. He did not know if dawn would bring death, forgiveness, or something far worse. He only knew that when the morning came, whatever waited beyond that door would be changed by what he had done in the dark. Morning light had not yet reached the cottonwoods when Elias Moore finally allowed himself to sit down. The fire still burned low and steady, and the man by the hearth still breathed. That alone felt like a fragile victory. Elias had lived on this land for more than 30 years, and every mile of it had shaped him into someone slow to trust and careful with mercy. He had come west as a young man with a team of tired horses and a head full of promises that never survived the dust. The land took his youth first, then his patience, and finally his family. His wife had lasted only 5 winters before sickness carried her away, and the child they never had became a silence that followed him from room to room. Since then the ranch had been his only companion, and even that demanded more than it gave. Each morning he rose before the sun, fed the cattle, repaired fences, and counted losses the way other men counted blessings. He had learned to measure distance by hours of riding and time by the seasons of drought and flood. 15 miles to town might as well have been another world, and most days he was glad for it. The people there had long memories and sharp tongues. They remembered which side a man chose when tempers flared along the river, and they did not forgive easily. Elias had tried once to speak against the hatred that settled over the valley like smoke, but he learned quickly that words did not change minds already set. So he kept to himself and let others believe what they wished. That was safer. The man on the floor stirred, and Elias stood at once, his joints aching, as if reminding him of every year he carried. The stranger did not reach for a weapon or speak. He simply watched the ceiling and then turned his eyes toward Elias with something that looked less like anger and more like disbelief. Elias recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror years ago after a winter storm stranded him without food, and a passing trapper had shared his last supplies without asking for payment. It was the look of someone who expected cruelty and found none. Elias checked the bandage and nodded to himself. The wound would not kill the man if infection stayed away. That was all he could offer. He poured water from his canteen and set it within reach, then returned to his chair. Outside the wind eased and the night grew quieter than before. Elias thought about how the fire had drawn the stranger like a signal. In this country, fire meant life. It meant a chance to last one more night. Sharing it was a risk he had not taken in many years. He wondered what had pushed him to do it now. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the memory of hands that once saved him. Or perhaps it was simply that he was tired of surviving without ever choosing anything. The hours crept forward and the darkness thinned. Elias did not sleep. He listened to the small sounds of the cabin and the breathing of another man sharing his space. He knew that when the sun rose there would be consequences. The valley did not ignore acts like this. Word traveled faster than horses when fear was involved. Yet as the first pale light touched the window, Elias felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It was not peace, and it was not courage. It was resolve. Whatever came with the morning, he would meet it standing beside the fire he chose to share. As the light grew stronger, the stranger finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, as if unused to being heard in places like this. He gave his name as Thomas Redwillow, and said he had crossed the river before dawn the day before. He did not explain why at first, and Elias did not ask. Out here, names were often all a man could give safely. Thomas shifted with pain and rested his back against the wall near the hearth. He kept his hands open and visible, and Elias noticed that before anything else. It was a habit learned in hard places. Thomas said he had been tracking a stray horse when he was caught between two patrols moving through the valley. One side wore badges, and the other wore memories. Neither side wanted witnesses. He had run until his strength failed, and the fence had stopped him cold. Elias listened without interrupting. He had heard different versions of this story from men in town and from riders who passed through. The details always changed, but the ending stayed the same. Someone bled, and someone else called it necessary. Thomas looked around the cabin as if memorizing it. He said he expected Elias to leave him outside. He said most men would have. Elias nodded once. He did not deny it. The fire popped softly and sent a spark upward. Thomas flinched and then laughed under his breath. He said that sound reminded him of home before the valley learned to measure itself by grudges. Elias felt something tighten behind his ribs. He asked where Thomas would go when he could stand. Thomas said he would return across the river if he was allowed. He said his people would not cross onto Elias' land if Elias did not want them to. The words were offered carefully, as if they carried weight beyond their sound. Elias studied the man and saw exhaustion more than threat. He saw fear held in check by pride. He also saw a chance for trouble he could not outride. Outside the cabin, a bird called, and then another. The morning had arrived, whether either man was ready or not. Elias stepped to the door and looked out. The frost was already melting, and the valley lay open and quiet. Too quiet. He could feel eyes on the land, though none showed themselves. He turned back and met Thomas. Gaze. Elias said the fire was shared, and that meant the night had passed. He said daylight changed rules, but not choices. Thomas nodded as if he understood that deeply. He asked for nothing else. He did not ask for protection or promises. He only asked for time to stand. Elias helped him slowly and felt the weight of another life leaning into his hands. It reminded him how long it had been since he carried anything but his own burdens. When Thomas reached his feet, he swayed and steadied himself against the table. He thanked Elias once. Not loudly, not with ceremony, just once. The words settled into the room like dust after a long ride. Elias said nothing in return. He opened the door wider and let the light fill the cabin. In that moment, Elias knew the valley would not forget this morning. Whether it answered with mercy or fire was no longer in his control. He had chosen already, and the choice stood between them like the last glowing ember of the night. The decision did not arrive as a single moment, but as a series of small refusals to turn away. Elias stood with the door open and felt the morning settle onto his shoulders like a weight he accepted without complaint. He knew the rules of this land as well as any man alive. A rancher did not shelter a wounded enemy and expect understanding. He did not offer water and warmth and believe it would be forgotten. The valley remembered everything. Elias looked at Thomas Red Willow standing unsteady near the table and saw not a symbol of conflict, but a man who had trusted the wrong silence and paid for it. Elias could still change his mind. He could tell Thomas to leave now while the ground still held the last trace of night. He could close the door and return to the habits that had kept him alive for decades. Instead, he reached for the kettle and poured warm water into a tin cup. He handed it over and waited while Thomas drank slowly, careful not to spill a drop. The simple act felt heavier than any weapon Elias had ever carried. Outside, a rider passed far off on the ridge and did not stop. That was luck or warning or both. Elias moved through the cabin with deliberate calm. He added another log to the fire and watched the flame catch. He said that as long as the fire burned, no man under his roof would be forced into the cold. The words were not a speech or a challenge. They were a line drawn where only he would have to stand. Thomas met his eyes and nodded. He did not argue or plead. He understood what was being offered and what it might cost. Time stretched, and Elias felt the old ache in his hands ease as he worked. He cleaned the table and set aside food without ceremony. He checked the window and the yard for signs of movement. Nothing yet. The valley held its breath. Elias thought about the men in town who would curse his name if they knew. He thought about the riders across the river who would judge this choice by their own measures. He did not belong fully to either world anymore. That realization settled something inside him. He had spent years believing that distance was safety. Now he understood that distance was only delay. When Thomas spoke again, his voice carried a steadier tone. He said that if Elias wished, he would leave before noon and take the risk with him. Elias shook his head. He said the wound would reopen and the road would finish what the night had not. He said staying was not mercy if it led to death. He told Thomas he would decide when he could stand without leaning on the walls. The words surprised them both. Elias had not planned to say them. They sounded like something a younger man might have offered without fear. Yet he felt no regret. The fire crackled and sent warmth into the room. Elias sat down and rested his hands on his knees. He realized then that this was the choice that mattered. Not the pulling of a man from the frost, but the willingness to remain present when consequences arrived. He would not hide the act or rush it out the door. He would meet the morning as it came. Thomas settled back and closed his eyes for a moment. The cabin filled with quiet that did not feel empty. It felt earned. Elias watched the light climb the wall and thought of the long road behind him. He did not know how the valley would answer. He only knew that he would answer the same way he had through the night, with the fire kept alive and his back straight against whatever came next. The 5th hour after sunrise carried a different weight than the night had. The fire still burned, but its light no longer hid the edges of things. Shadows pulled back, and the cabin showed its age and its truth. Elias felt the weighting settle into his bones. This was the part he feared most. Not the act itself, but the space after it, when every sound carried meaning. Thomas Red Willow slept in short, careful breaths. Each rise and fall of his chest felt like a promise Elias had already made. Outside, the cottonwoods stood still as if listening. Elias stepped onto the porch and scanned the valley with the slow patience of a man who had counted storms by their sound. Tracks were there now. Fresh ones. Hooves and boots pressed into the softening frost. They did not rush. That worried him more than speed would have. The riders knew the land. They knew how to approach without noise. Elias returned inside and added a log to the fire. He did not wake Thomas. Mercy did not require ceremony. It required steadiness. The hours stretched and the quiet thickened. A crow passed overhead and called once. Then again. Elias remembered a winter long ago when he had buried a neighbor without help because fear had kept others away. The memory sharpened his resolve. He would not let fear decide again. Near midday, the first figures appeared at the edge of the field. They stopped at a distance and waited. More came from different lines until the fence held a silent audience. Elias counted them without moving his lips. The count did not comfort him. Thomas stirred and opened his eyes. He followed Elias' gaze and nodded. He said nothing. He did not need to. Elias opened the door and stepped out. He did not carry his rifle. He carried only the knowledge of what he had done and the willingness to stand by it. The men beyond the fence did not advance. They watched. Their faces held questions rather than anger. That surprised Elias. He raised a hand in greeting that offered no challenge. Time slowed to the pace of breath. Elias felt the sun warm his back and thought about how simple It would be to step aside and let the moment pass without words. He chose not to. He spoke clearly and said the man inside had been given fire and water through the night. He said no harm had come from it. He said the valley had enough graves and did not need another made from silence. The words traveled farther than he expected. A murmur moved through the line like wind through grass. One of the riders dismounted and approached the fence alone. He stopped and placed his hands where all could see. Elias did the same. The distance between them felt measured by years rather than steps. The rider looked past Elias to the cabin and then back again. He said the man inside was expected home. He said the night had been long for many people. Elias nodded. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply said the fire had been shared, and that sharing changed things. The rider studied him, as if weighing more than the moment. He glanced at the others, and then back to Elias. He said they would wait. The word landed with the force of restraint. Waiting meant choice. Elias returned to the cabin with his shoulders still square. He sat and listened to the fire and the breathing beside it. He understood now that the real danger was not the crowd outside, but the temptation to rush an ending. He would not. He would let the hours do their work. Whatever came next would come because of patience rather than fear. By the 6th hour, the waiting had grown heavier than any threat Elias Moore had faced before. The men beyond the fence remained where they were, and that choice pressed on him like a held breath. Thomas Red Willow was awake, now sitting upright with effort, and watching the door as if he understood that stillness could break faster than glass. Elias poured water and handed it over, then sat across from him. No words passed. Outside, the sun climbed higher and revealed more figures along the ridge. They were not gathering in anger, but in numbers, and that carried its own danger. Elias knew how quickly a crowd could become something else if fear found a voice. He thought of the town 15 miles away and how news would already be traveling. He imagined riders turning there. Horses toward his land, driven by rumor rather than truth. The valley had always been like that. A spark caught, and the fire ran. He stepped outside again and let his eyes trace the ground. Tracks crossed and recrossed near the fence, showing movement without advance. The men were conferring without noise. Elias felt the urge to speak again, to push the moment forward, but he resisted it. He had learned long ago that forcing a hand often made it clench. Inside the cabin, Thomas shifted and tested his weight. He could stand now, without help, though pain tightened his jaw. He said quietly that he would go if Elias asked. Elias looked at him and saw not relief, but readiness. That settled the matter. Elias shook his head. He said the fire had been shared, and the sharing did not end at convenience. He said leaving now would turn a choice into a chase, and he would not do that to either of them. Thomas accepted the answer with a small nod. The sun moved and shadows shortened. The heat of the day began to build, and the fire in the hearth burned lower, as if aware of the change. Elias opened the window to let air move through. The sounds of the valley returned slowly. Insects stirred, and a distant bird called. The waiting men remained quiet. One by one they sat on the ground and set their weapons aside within reach, but not in hand. That detail did not escape Elias. It was escalation without violence, and it demanded an answer just as strong. Elias stepped out again and stood where all could see him. He did not raise his voice. He said the man inside would walk out when he could walk with dignity. He said the night had passed without blood, and that mattered. He said the valley could choose what kind of mourning it would be remembered for. The words did not accuse or plead. They offered a path. A long silence followed. Then the rider who had spoken earlier stood and came closer, stopping short of the fence again. He said the injury had been feared worse. He said the waiting was for that knowledge. Elias nodded and felt a thread of tension ease, though it did not break. The rider looked back at the others and made a small motion. Several stood and turned their faces away from the cabin toward the open land. It was not retreat yet, but it was a shift. Elias returned inside and met Thomas' eyes. He said it would soon be time. Thomas breathed deeply and adjusted the bandage himself. He did not thank Elias again. Gratitude had already been spoken. The fire crackled once and settled into coals. Elias understood then that escalation did not always mean more danger. Sometimes it meant more people choosing restraint at the same time. He stood and waited with his back straight and his hands empty, knowing the next step would decide whether this day would end in noise or in silence. The sun began its slow descent, and the light changed from sharp to forgiving, as if the valley itself had decided to soften its gaze. Elias Moore felt the shift before he saw it. The men beyond the fence rose together, not in threat, but in readiness. Their movements were deliberate and calm. No one reached for a weapon. No one shouted. The quiet carried weight. Elias turned and looked at Thomas Red Willow, who stood on his own, now steady enough to meet what waited outside. Thomas drew a breath and let it out slowly. He said the morning had already done what force never could. Elias understood. This was the hour when choices revealed their true cost. Elias stepped outside first and felt the warmth of the afternoon settle against his back. He did not look behind him at first. He faced the valley and the men who had gathered there and waited. When Thomas joined him, the space between them felt deliberate and respectful. The line of men opened without command. A path appeared where none had been before. Elias watched as Thomas took his first steps forward. Each one was careful and unhurried. The wound held. The bandage stayed clean. That small mercy felt larger than it should have. The rider who had spoken earlier stepped aside and inclined his head. Others followed. The gesture spread through the line until silence carried a shape Elias had never seen here before. No one blocked the path. No one followed close. Thomas walked until he reached the fence and paused. He turned back once and met Elias' eyes. There was no triumph there and no sorrow. Only recognition. Thomas placed a hand against the post and then stepped beyond it. The men closed the line behind him, not to trap, but to shield. They moved away from the cabin and toward the open land. Elias stood alone by the door with the valley breathing around him. The unthinkable had begun not with noise, but with restraint. He watched until the figures grew smaller and the land reclaimed them. The sun touched the tops of the cottonwoods and painted them gold. Elias felt the day settle into something that could be remembered without shame. He returned inside and stirred the coals, letting the fire fade into embers. He did not need it now. Outside, the valley resumed its ordinary sounds. Insects moved and birds crossed the sky. No riders came from town. No shouts followed. The waiting had ended without a single order given. Elias sat and rested his hands on his knees. He thought of the night and the fire and the choice that had seemed so small then. He understood now that dawn had not brought an ending. It had brought a beginning shaped by silence and held together by patience. The valley would speak of this day in its own way. Stories would change as they always did, but the truth would remain where it mattered most. Elias stood once more and looked out at the empty fence line. The sun dipped lower and the light softened further. He felt something loosen inside him that had been tight for years. Out here, justice did not always arrive with sound. Sometimes it arrived as men walking away from the chance to harm one another. Elias closed the door gently and let the quiet hold. What followed was not a return to normal, but something quieter and far more unsettling. As the light faded, Elias Moore noticed movement again along the ridge, yet this time it came from the direction of town. 3 riders approached at an easy pace, their horses walking as if there were no urgency left in the day. Elias stepped onto the porch and waited. He felt no fear, now only a steady awareness of consequence. The riders stopped short of the fence and dismounted. They were men Elias knew by sight, if not by name. One carried a badge that caught the sun and dulled it. Another held his hat in both hands. None reached for a weapon. They asked if the wounded man had passed through. Elias answered truthfully and said the man had rested and left on his feet. He said the night had ended without harm. The words seemed to deflate something in them. The man with the badge nodded slowly and said there would be no pursuit. He said the valley had seen enough for one season. Elias watched them turn their horses and ride back the way they came, leaving only dust and the sound of hooves fading. The unthinkable had happened again, and still there was no noise. As evening deepened, Elias noticed shapes returning near the fence from the opposite side of the land. They did not come close. They did not call out. They stood at a distance, and then one figure stepped forward alone. He carried no weapon and no sign of rank. He placed a bundle on the ground and stepped back. The group waited. Elias approached slowly and saw the bundle was wrapped in clean cloth. Inside were provisions enough to last through the coming weeks, dried meat, grain, and a small pouch of seeds. There was also a piece of carved wood smoothed by many hands. Elias recognized it as a token of passage given when a debt was settled without blood. He looked up and met the eyes of the lone figure, who inclined his head once. No words were exchanged. The group turned and moved away into the darkening land, leaving the gift behind. Elias carried the bundle inside and set it on the table. He did not feel triumph. He felt the weight of a promise kept by many people who would never speak of it again. Night returned gently. Elias lit the lamp and sat beside the cold hearth. He thought of Thomas Red Willow walking home under the same sky. He thought of the riders who chose restraint over order. He thought of the fire that had started it all. The valley had answered kindness with something rarer than reward. It had answered with restraint on all sides. That was the miracle no one would write down. Elias stepped outside one last time and looked at the stars. The land was unchanged, yet everything felt different. He knew tomorrow would bring work and rumor and doubt. He knew some would curse his name and others would never mention it. But he also knew that when the fire was needed again, he would not hesitate. The unthinkable had happened because one man chose to share warmth and many others chose to step back from harm. Elias closed the door and let the quiet settle, knowing that out here justice often arrived without witnesses and left without a trace. The next morning arrived without announcement, and Elias more woke to a quiet that felt earned rather than empty. Sunlight slipped through the window and touched the floor where the fire had once burned. The hearth was cold now, yet the room held warmth in a way that had nothing to do with flame. Elias stood and stretched his stiff back, then stepped outside. The valley looked the same as it always had, wide and patient, and indifferent to the stories men told about it. Cattle moved slowly along the fence, and the cottonwoods whispered as they always did. Nothing marked the place where a crowd had gathered or where restraint had changed the course of many lives. Elias walked the fence line and found the ground already smoothing itself as if the land wished to forget. He understood that forgetting was not the same as forgiveness, but it was close enough to allow living to continue. He returned to the cabin and prepared a simple meal, using the provisions left behind. As he worked, he noticed how steady his hands felt. For years they had shaken slightly when he paused long enough to think. Now they were still. He ate at the table and looked at the carved token resting beside the lamp. He did not hang it on the wall or put it away. He left it where it lay, a reminder without weight. Outside, a rider passed at a distance and lifted a hand in greeting before moving on. Elias returned the gesture without thought. The day unfolded with ordinary tasks and ordinary sounds. A fence needed repair, and a calf wandered where it should not. Elias fixed what needed fixing and let the rest be. He thought once of Thomas Red Willow walking somewhere beyond the ridge and hoped the wound had closed cleanly. He did not imagine meetings or future debts. The night had been shared, and that was enough. Toward evening, Elias built a small fire not out of need, but out of habit, and watched it catch. He remembered the fear he had felt before dawn and how it had loosened its grip when faced with patience. He understood now that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it waited and allowed others to choose who they would be. As the sky darkened, Elias sat on the porch and listened to the land settle. He felt no need to guard the door or count the hours. The valley had spoken in its own way, and he had listened. When the stars appeared, Elias thought of how many nights he had spent believing that survival meant isolation. He knew better now. Survival could also mean standing still and allowing a different ending to take shape. He rose and went inside, closing the door gently. The fire burned low and steady. Elias watched it until the embers glowed, and then he let them fade. Out here, justice did not need witnesses or words. It needed one man willing to share warmth and many others willing to walk away from harm. Elias lay down and slept deeply, knowing that the unthinkable had not been loud or grand. It had been quiet and human, and it had left the valley breathing easier for it. This dramatic frontier tale follows an aging rancher whose single act of compassion alters the fate of an entire valley when he chooses mercy over hatred on a cold night at the edge of the American West. Through silence, restraint, and moral courage, the story reveals how justice can arrive without violence and how dignity can change the course of history without a single shot fired. Perfect for fans of Western stories who value deep emotion, authentic frontier atmosphere, and powerful human choices, this narrative explores honor, fear, and quiet bravery in a land shaped by old wounds. If you are drawn to Western stories that focus on character-driven drama, moral tension, and unforgettable endings, this is a journey worth taking. Inspired by classic Western stories and told with cinematic detail, this piece captures the soul of the frontier while reminding us that the strongest moments often come without noise. For listeners seeking meaningful Western stories rooted in compassion, restraint, and timeless values, this story delivers a lasting emotional impact.